Greetings. Last Thursday, Lasonia Crutchfield shared an interesting article on Facebook which covered a recent attempt by scientists to reconstruct the faces of three mummies from ancient Egypt. Quite a bit of interesting discussion ensued, so I felt inspired to make a short video on the subject, as I think this speaks to the topic of the diversity which existed at various points in the history of ancient Egypt. And for anyone interested, in the various sources which I'll be using for this video, I'll share relevant links in the video description. Now, the first thing I would note is that the article very roughly dated the three mummies to 2,000 years ago. As will come up in a bit, that figure was arrived at by rounding off the actual dates. Nonetheless, with the rough dating in mind, it should be stated that if these attempted facial reconstructions accurately reflect how those men looked, it simply would mean that the spectrum of morphologies in Egypt, roughly around the time of the dawn of the Common Era, overlapped with the spectrum of morphologies which are found in modern Egypt today. And that's something which we could have also inferred from the Fayum mummy portraits. Now, some have acknowledged this fact, but have also somewhat flippantly, with a bit of disdainful hand-waving, declared that those are just Romans or just Greeks. So in this brief video, I'd like to elaborate a bit on the details, as I think the facts of the matter are both interesting and more complex than some may realize. To begin, let's focus on the man in the middle. Note that he's designated with the ID JK2888. Those IDs are important to note, as you can use them to look up more information about the relevant samples online. And again, I'll provide more information in the video description. It turns out that this individual, again with the ID JK2888, had haplogroup EV22, which is a subclade of E1B1b. To be more specific, his haplogroup is a subclade of EM35, which itself was also found amongst two of the ancient Natufian samples in Palestine. It seems reasonable to propose that this man may have descended paternally from a Northeast African population. He might even be describable as indigenous to Egypt or a nearby part of Northeast Africa, though honestly take that as a maybe, as older samples of upstream clades from that line have also been found in Europe and Asia. So do with that as you will. Whatever the case, this particular sample is dated to just under 2,000 years ago. So he lived right at the dawn of the Common Era. Now, some viewers might think that if this attempted facial reconstruction accurately reflects how he looked, he doesn't quite look like one stereotype of an ancient Northeast African, or the stereotype that some might have of an ancient person with haplogroup E1B1b. With that in mind, it needs to be stressed that haplogroups are not limited to a specific morphology. Persons with the same haplogroup can run across a spectrum of morphologies, a spectrum of skin tones and hair textures, right? So that said, however, even if the man did look like that depiction, that would not rule out the possibility of him descending paternally from someone significantly darker. Note that various pharaohs were, in their respective times, the wealthiest and most powerful men in the region. And so with that in mind, I would think that it's likely that some of those pharaohs, and so too some of their higher-ranking attendants, their ministers and generals, that some of them were, if you'll forgive the language, some of them were laying down with all sorts of different women, including, but definitely not limited to, women from Southern Europe. Now, I'm sorry, but it's simply a fact that wealthy and powerful men typically have access to more women and typically take advantage of those opportunities. So even if, the point to be made here is that even if a particular member of the ancient Egyptian elite was dark-skinned at one point in history, that in itself does not preclude his patrilineal descendants from being significantly lighter. But that aside, that more salacious topic aside, let's now turn to the man on the left with the ID JK2134. His haplogroup was a subclade of J1A, and his body is dated to roughly 2,600 years ago. So he predates the Greek conquest of Egypt, and he might likewise predate the Persian Achaemenid conquest of Egypt. Or at the very least, he lived right at the cusp of that conquest, just either immediately before or right at the very beginning. And moving on to the man on the right with the ID JK2911, His haplogroup was a subclade of J2b. He is likewise dated to roughly 2,600 years ago. Now, this diversity of haplogroups implies a diversity of lineages amongst the people residing in ancient Egypt. However, one should not be surprised, as even common sense would likewise tell us that, a major power center like Egypt would bring in people from a variety of places. Some might have been brought there forcibly, and this includes women, by the way, but others would have come voluntarily seeking better economic opportunities. And, that's simply what power centers tend to do. They tend to draw in people from lots of different places. And if one is interested in a biblical allusion to this fact, one can contemplate the implications of Genesis 41:57, which touches on how a major power center like Egypt can draw in people from a variety of places, including people looking to better themselves economically, and better themselves in terms of their substance. Now, while two of these men apparently lived right on the cusp of the aforementioned Persian Achaemenid conquest of Egypt, the sort of diversity that we're talking about here long predates that conquest. A particularly interesting example in this regard are the mummies Chnum Nacht and Nacht Ankh. They lived more than a millennium before the Persian conquest of Egypt. And as you can see, they seem to be depicted rather differently. However, as a disclaimer, in a vacuum, these artistic depictions, these differences in artistic depictions, might not have been intended as, allusions to their actual skin tones. For all we know, this could have been an allusion to something more symbolic or metaphorical. Whatever the case, their story, if you put aside those depictions, those artistic depictions, their story gets more interesting when one turns to the genetic analysis of their bodies. Such studies reveal that they apparently had the same mother, but different fathers. More interesting, while Chnum Nacht's precise paternal haplogroup was not determined, Nacht Ankh might have had haplogroup H2M. Now, as a disclaimer, let me again state that one's haplogroup does not determine one's morphology. But morphology aside, it is at least possible that Nacht Ankh descended paternally from a European population. Note that his haplogroup is a subclade of HP96, which is also known as H2, and significantly older samples of that haplogroup have been found in Germany, Hungary, Italy, Croatia, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, France, Spain, and Portugal, which is to say they've been found across much of Europe. Now, some might wish to ask this question: is this what you think ancient Hamites look like? These different depictions that have appeared on the screen. And I would reply that I have no idea what the biblical Ham looked like, but if we are defining Hamites as patrilineal descendants of the biblical Ham, then his descendants could run across a spectrum of morphologies. But that aside, a distinction should be made between a person living in Egypt and a patrilineal descendant of Ham. These men lived in ancient Egypt, but they were not necessarily patrilineal descendants of Ham. In fact, in light of the genetic diversity among them, I would conclude that at least some of them definitely were not descendants of Ham. But, as I said before, Egypt was a major power center and thus drew in different people from a variety of other places. We should think of it as a multi-ethnic society over the course of various points in antiquity. And that's the sole point of this video, just to highlight a bit more the diversity which existed at various points in ancient Egypt. That's all. So on that note, I'll close here. I hope you found this interesting. I may delve into this subject again in the near future. Who knows? Whatever the case, as always, comments are most welcome, including criticisms. God bless.